All right. Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us on this kind of gray day in Columbus. Nice and warm, though. We are here today to talk about two of the biggest issues that's kind of been going down in the budget this week. One is the newly proposed K through 12 education funding formula. And also, there was a lot of interesting things that happened in the transportation budget that was passed and signed by Governor DeWine this week. We have two incredible experts here to give us some details on both of those proposals and new initiatives. But before they get started, I just wanted to give a quick kind of timeline update on what's been happening this week at the State House. In the Health and Human Service Finance Subcommittee, most of the agencies testified this week, had a couple per day. The agency directors came in and talked about their major initiatives and received questions from members of the committee. Everything went as expected, I would say. And then this past Thursday was the first day for public testimony in that committee. There were, I believe, 14 witnesses and also a panel concerning multi-system youth. So that has been a very big issue in Health and Human Service Committee and with funding overall. In the next few weeks, we'll be doing a webinar focused just on this population. Again, multi-system youth are young people who have complex needs and are served by a variety of agencies on both the state and county level. So we will be moving forward with that. Next week, there'll be 4 days of public testimony as well. Advocates for Ohio's Future will be testifying on Tuesday morning. A good portion of our executive committee will be discussing, some of our policy priorities, asking for more funding in a couple of programs, as well as talking about some policy changes. So we are looking forward to that on Tuesday. I know a number of our members are also testifying next week as well. Also, we have a big deadline coming up at the State House. In the House, it's the first amendment deadline this coming Friday, April 12th. This means that any other representatives who want changes to the budget and maybe to further some of their own initiatives, they have to have those submitted to the Legislative Service Commission by this coming Friday, the 12th. It allows them to kind of draft it in bill language, and then the overall Finance Committee and leadership will discuss some of the changes that they want to make in the sub-bill to be released sometime, hopefully the following week. All right, and as I said earlier, we have two experts with us today to talk about two of the major initiatives happening at the State House. We have Daryl Johnson, he's the Director of Legislation for the Ohio Federation of Teachers, and Amanda Woodrum is joining us from Policy Matters Ohio, where she's a senior researcher. So we are going to hand it off to Daryl Johnson to talk about the Fair School Funding Plan with Representatives Cupp and Representative Patterson.
Good morning, everybody. I want to talk to you briefly about what's going on with the Fair School Funding Plan. As you know, this was a plan that was developed with a year's worth of work, like 15 months worth of work by superintendents and treasurers across the state to look at all the aspects of the base cost formula. The goal of this was to create a formula that would send 95% of the money to the classroom, either through direct classroom instruction or school leadership operation or instruction and student support. And basically what we had was a formula that wasn't working because we had 4 out of 5 schools that were either on a cap, which means if they were growing in population, they weren't getting money for every new student. They were getting money based on a cap formula, or districts that were on a guarantee. And so the guarantee was saying that we weren't going to reduce your funding, even though your enrollment may have gone down, but because you have high poverty or those situations, we're going to keep you on this guarantee. So the idea is to move off of caps and guarantees to have the money go to where the child's educated and to focus on the key elements of education. So the base cost includes looking at instructional costs, instructional supports, co-curriculars, safety in school, and school security, um, social emotional program support, technical support, internet access, school leadership and principal and other facilities development, and also developing monies for um, the central offices. What we want to do is they just released their formula, I guess. Time flies, but they recently just released their district runs for each of the districts, and we found something interesting. We found that the suburban schools were getting like 30% of the money, and that urban schools were getting like 5% of the increase, and rurals were in a mixed situation. Some were doing well, some weren't doing as well. And so what we have gone back and talked to Representative Cupp and Patterson about um, is how to create more equity. So as you know, equity is basically what we want is to provide funds to lift those kids who are in poverty in a way that they can close the achievement gap with those kids who don't live in poverty. So most of those suburban and wealthier districts. The other reason we want to do that is because there is no really rhyme or reason why either in the Cup-Patterson formula why some districts are getting better and districts right next to them aren't. We know there's a rhyme or reason to it, but they haven't really fully funded the poverty piece of their formula, and because they haven't fully funded that piece, it's left some districts behind, and we need to work on that. We want to be clear that the Cup-Patterson formula is an excellent formula because we have not had a school funding formula for 8 years. Because we haven't had a school funding formula, we sort of just been doing a patch mill quilt approach to school funding. And the districts that have been doing well over the last 8 years have been doing well because they increased their property taxes. And so by increasing their property taxes, they've created an over-reliance on property, which is against the DeRoff ruling, and we need to move away from that. So we do support the Cup-Patterson formula. We think it's a good way to have a formula that will grow over time because it's sort of indexed to inflation, and it has a committee that will look at the components of the formula periodically, and they can make adjustments to the formula on an ongoing basis. So we think those are all positive pieces. And that's sort of the Cup-Patterson piece in a nutshell.
That's great, Daryl. Could you tell us a little bit more about the preschool piece? I know there were some recommendations for all 4-year-olds to have high quality preschool, and this plan was supposed to fund it. I know early childhood education is a really hot topic down at the State House, and just kind of wanted your overall thoughts on what
Yeah,
it's
I think. Yeah, so we do support the emphasis on preschool because we do obviously think that addressing one of the ways to address poverty is to have high quality preschool, and what we wanted to do is to make sure that happens. The issue there is trying to make sure that we offer it to many 3 or 4-year-olds as we can, and 2, that gets into an issue of logistics sometimes. So that's going to be an issue for some school districts, I've heard, as they move forward. But I was just in Federal Hocking yesterday in Athens County, and they have a room in their building that they have for 4-year-olds. It's not an ongoing preschool program, but it's a way to start dealing with the 4-year-olds before they come to kindergarten. And it's that kind of opportunity in high poverty areas that can make all the difference in making sure children are ready to come to school, um, ready to learn.
That's great, Daryl. And again, that's an awesome ideal, but we do have a question coming in wondering, we haven't really seen funding details on how they're going to support every 4-year-old to have this opportunity. Have you seen any kind of numbers, or is this a goal that is currently kind of up in the air as to how
Well,
the administration will?
yeah, it's two things to that, and they had a number like, for example, uh, they were going to do $272 per student. Uh, they were going to increase the amount that students get for per student for poverty, but they haven't fully got there yet. The other thing for what they want to do is for the preschool part of that, which piggybacks with the governor's preschool money, and I think that two of those things could go together. Um, so we haven't. So what a district gets total in the formula will be part of part of that money can be used in preschool. So here's two things. They are going to, in their formula, they have monies for preschool for 4-year-olds. It will be up to parents and advocates at the district level to make sure districts use some of their funding for preschool. And so that's because it's all local option. I mean, it's local control. So they're making these recommendations, and they're basing the formula off of what you should use. But they're also piggybacking on the federal money that's coming for early childhood. So it's a piggyback between the federal money that's coming in and what they're putting in the formula for every 4-year-old. So it's piggybacking off of what DeWine already put in the budget for the preschool piece of that. But
Mhm.
local people are going to have to really advocate for those 4-year-olds getting into programs, because when the last time we had this money out there, there was a lot of pushback about not having all-day kindergarten, or not having room at the schools to do it, and how you would do it. So it's going to take a lot of advocacy to see that roll out.
Certainly, and I know a lot of people with joining us today are welcome and ready to join in that fight. One last question for you, Gerald. So we've heard a lot about wraparound services in schools. I know Governor DeWine committed $550 million for what he dubbed wraparound services in schools, including things like mentoring, access to mental health services within our schools. What do you think the chances are of that $550 million remaining kind of dedicated for those funds? Or do you think that the General Assembly might think that maybe they can pull from those dollars to support other K through 12 funding initiatives?
Well, I think that's not just a General Assembly idea. I think that's an idea that we have as well, for several
Right.
reasons. First of all, $550 million that he's advocating is not a guarantee. It's additional money he's throwing in on a formula that doesn't work, that keeps people on caps and guarantees. It's $550 million that that's you can use on these 10 items. And if you get, we have small districts that could get $2 million over the biennium. But what do you use $2 million for in a small community if you don't know that money's going to be there in 2022 and 2023? So we're advocating that we use some of those dollars for going into the formula to address poverty, because that's what the governor wants to do, and that's what we talk about, equity. And so we think that there should be some of that money used to better address equity, so that we we don't leave districts with high poverty behind. We're also saying that if you want to have money for wraparound services, you can have some monies. But I've seen other states that dedicate line items for wraparound services, and when that money dries up or goes away, so does the wraparound services. Wraparound services can be sustained by using Medicaid or other foundation funding, those kind of things. In Cincinnati, they asked every provider of a wraparound service to come with a 5-year plan and tell the people in that school building how you're going to maintain your program for 5 years, meaning how you're going to fund it and how you're going to sustain it for 5 years. That's a better way to go in terms of doing some of these wraparound services. Now, if you want to have monies to help districts start up and get people going, you could do that, or you want to have some monies for changing or rehabbing facilities so you can have the dental clinic, the health clinic, or another access to the building so you can make your services available to the community. That would all be very good as well. So I think that does give us an opportunity to put some money into a formula that's going to grow over time, that moves people off of caps and guarantees, that people can plan for, and then start using other parts of that for other resources, but you still address the governor's intent of helping children who live in poverty.
Wonderful. Daryl, thank you so much for sharing. Again, this new school funding formula has been introduced, and they're having hearings on it right now in the Ohio House within the budget. Again, the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate both have opportunities to examine and hear testimony on this new plan, and I'm sure we'll make some changes to it as the process moves along. But Daryl, thank you so much for that overview. We really appreciate it. All right, and then next up on our list, we have Amanda Woodrum from Policy Matters Ohio is going to share with us some more about the transportation budget. I'm sure you've seen a lot of media coverage about gas taxes and front license plates and all that good stuff. Amanda's going to tell us a little bit more about what actually passed in the bill and what it means for you and your time on the road.
Great, thank you. I wanted to start just providing a little bit of background on the transportation budget, because even if you follow the budget, the state budget, you may not be entirely aware that there's a separate budget just for transportation. And like the General Revenue Fund, it is a 2-year budget. The revenues are made up largely of the state's gas tax, motor vehicle registration and license fees, as well as a solid chunk of funds from federal transportation dollars. And so that's where the money comes from. The money largely goes to the Ohio Department of Transportation, but we also put a few $100 million into the Department of Public Safety. That's largely for things like highway patrols. And a very small amount of money also goes to public works and development services. Typically, the transportation budget is not controversial, but it does move very, very fast. And this year it moved particularly fast because it was introduced a little bit late. That often happens with a new governor, but it was even later than expected. And it has to be wrapped up by, according to statute, by March 31st. So we got it late February, had to be done by March 31st. So it's really just a little bit more than 5 weeks for it to move through both the House, the Senate, and then ultimately a conference committee. So I said typically it's not controversial. You probably heard a lot about it this year because from the very beginning, major stakeholders were advocating that we really have a funding crisis for the state's roads and highways, and we need to address that funding crisis by increasing the gas tax. And because of the conversation around that was happening, Governor DeWine created an advisory committee who then got together and advised the governor to, in fact, go ahead and increase the gas tax, which he went ahead and did. He put together an executive budget proposal that included, as you probably heard in the press, an 18-cent gas tax increase. That's for both gasoline as well as diesel, and that will become a little bit more important later on. And that was estimated to would bring in an additional $1.2 billion in new revenues annually to the state, transportation purposes. Now, to the point that one of the major points that I'll be talking about throughout the presentation, in the governor's executive budget proposal, he also put in a line item for public transportation. That included what amounts to about it was $40 million in total, but that was a $7 million increase for public transit. And so I want to point out a couple of things. One is this new budget, which is more than $8 billion in over 2 years, so about $4 billion for each year. But they're proposing about $40 million for public transit, so that's roughly 1% entire transportation budget. And while we're proposing to increase road revenues for roads in the billions of dollars, we're talking about an increase of $7 million for public transit, which is about 0.005% of the total increase in revenues. And that sort of takes us to the next slide, where we're hearing a lot in the press about how there's a funding crisis for roads, but public transit has been in crisis for decades because we have invested in it for really nearly 3/4 of a century. And as a result, transit is nowhere near where it should be. The state is not an active partner in our public transit systems, and Ohio is ranked 40th in the nation for its commitment to public transit. This is despite the fact that we're really the 7th most populated state, and we should be ranking. We also have more urban areas than any other state, so we should be ranking at least closer to number 7 in support for public transit, not the bottom of the pack. And that matters. So we've created over time a transportation system that relies heavily on cars. It's really extremely difficult in this state to get by without a car, but cars are expensive. They're expensive to own. They're expensive to operate. They're expensive to insure. And for many low-income families, they're prohibitively expensive. And for the elderly and people with disabilities, driving may not even be an option at all. So over the maybe past decade or so, we have been growing a very passionate network of transit advocates across the state. And for the budget process, we reactivated that coalition. And our goal was really to draw attention to the transit crisis and really integrate that crisis with a conversation around the funding crisis that we're hearing about for roads. And specifically, we advocated for a portion of the gas tax revenues, if it were to increase, that a portion of it should go to public transit, that we need to have a more balanced approach to our transportation system. And we were a network of about 40 organizations, a little bit more than 40 actually. Many of them represent older adults and people with disabilities, historic historically disadvantaged communities, environmental advocates, transit union workers, and we had several locally based transit coalitions in Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Toledo, and Lorain County. And we also had some uh, folks from the Healthy Community Partnership of Mahoning Valley, and yeah, and we're seeing this a lot more. Focus on the social determinants of health, and transportation is a key piece of that conversation. So we were a diverse group, both organizationally and geographically, and we advocated a portion of the gas tax revenues go to public transit, and really at a minimum we should be funding transit at around 150 million at this point. This is based on the Ohio Department of Transportation's own transit needs study, and really that's the minimum. We also advocated for an additional 30 million for safe pedestrian and bicycling infrastructure. And so that takes us to the next slide. All separately from the Transit Coalition, Policy Matters was advocating around the Ohio's earned income tax credit. As many of you probably know, Ohio already has an earned income tax credit, but it's not particularly effective for a number of reasons. But it became part of this conversation because which is may not immediately collect in your mind, why are we talking about the earned income tax credit when we're talking about the transportation budget? But the gas tax, like sales taxes, is regressive. So it has a disproportionate impact on low to moderate income families. And so we saw this as a great opportunity to also highlight the need to reform Ohio's earned income tax credit. And what that really means is to expand it, remove the income cap, but most importantly, to make it refundable. The most important thing about the earned income tax credit is really that struggling families get a check in the mail during the tax season. A portion of money relatively large that they can do things they might not otherwise be able to do, like fix an unreliable car, buy groceries. So that's really the cash infusion that makes a difference in both an individual's life, but also it's good for the local economy because low-income folks spend money locally. They don't send it to the Cayman Islands or wherever. So that cash infusion into the household also represents a cash infusion to the local economy. So that's what we were looking at: expanding public transit funding and expanding and reforming Ohio's earned income tax credit. So the budget the transportation budget, like the general revenue fund, starts with the proposal from the governor. It's introduced into the House of Representatives, where they proceed to debate it and put their own stamp on it. And here, the House decides to lower the gas tax increase from the governor's initial proposal, and that increases transit funding to $100 million in federal flexible transportation dollars. So this is kind of a breaking of a glass ceiling because that's a significant amount of money. It's less than what we were advocating. It's less than what the Ohio Department's own studies suggest it should be, but it's recognizably significant, and it says we value public transit and the role it plays in helping low-income people get where they need to go, work, the doctor's office, grocery store. Is really important link to education and opportunity, as well as quality of life. Um, so once it's finalized in the House, it moves to the Senate. The Senate then reduces the gas tax further, but more importantly, for our purposes, they zeroed out transit in the transportation budget. They didn't zero it out altogether. Instead, though, they put it into the general revenue fund, and there they also lower the amount to 55 million. And interestingly, they adopted the earned income tax uh, and earned income tax reform, which increases the size of the credit from 10% of the federal EITC to 30%. They removed the income cap, which is really important. But what they didn't do, however, is make it refundable. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So a lot of activity following this, what the Senate did, because the House version and the Senate version are so different, we fully expect that there's going to be a conference committee with people from both the House and the Senate to work to iron out a compromise. And so during that time, we are pushing both to get the transit funding back into the transportation budget, and not keep it in the general revenue fund. And we are also advocating hard for the earned income tax to be refundable, because that's really the key. And the conference committee comes out with an interesting compromise. It looks, as far as the gas tax, a lot more like what the House did. 10.5 cents on tax on gas and 19 cents on diesel, which is very interesting, that latter part, because business community came out hard against increasing the gas by that much on diesel, but they went ahead and did it anyway. And this will bring in roughly $865 million in new revenues for roads. They landed at $70 million per year for public transit, which is almost double where it was in the last budget, which is close to $40 million. So that's a step in the right direction, but it stays in the general revenue fund and not the transportation budget. We'll talk a little bit more about why that particular piece is troubling. And the reforms to the Ohio Earned Income Tax Credit stayed in. It's now, so once the governor signed it, which he did, the earned income tax is now 30% of the federal earned income tax. We have removed the income cap. That means there's no cliff. It phases out slowly with the federal earned income tax credit, but it remains not refundable. And the cost is estimated about $38 million for that. And that takes us to our final slide. So at the end of the day, we have taken a positive step for public transit funding. I'm particularly excited that we hit that sort of glass ceiling at $100 million. When I first started that work, it was almost inconceivable to folks that we could get that high. It's not even half of where we should be, but it's a solid progress. But again, taking it out of the transportation budget is a huge setback. First, we haven't, and putting it in the general revenue fund is not great. And the first reason is that historically transit has been funded out of the general revenue fund. We spent the last 10 years trying to get it into the transportation budget because transit did not do well in the general revenue fund. There it competes with education, Medicaid, health and human services. Economic development is not winning that battle. battle, wasn't winning that battle. It has a lot more room to grow in the transportation budget. Also, as we continue to debate the general revenue fund, even now, we haven't made the hard decisions of where that funding for transit is going to come out of. Is it going to come out of Medicaid, education? I don't, we haven't lead abatement. I don't know. We haven't made that decision yet. And we would prefer that it came out of what we set aside for transportation, because public transit is a form of transportation. It's not just a health and human service. So when we're making decision about what our transportation system, we really should be considering a more comprehensive system that's not just roads and highways, but more affordable, accessible, and environmentally friendly transportation and the options. So I feel like I have gone way over my time. And in the short run, we'll do some more work in the GRF. The long run, we really need to get transit back into the transportation budget, and we need to focus on making that earned income tax credit refundable. And we're going to start looking at state models for tiered system of refundability, because a 30% refundable credit would be very expensive. We think it would be a hard push, but if we can figure out a tiered system so that the lowest income get a larger refund. Some states have such a system. We'll be looking into that, and I think that's the best. All right. Sorry if I went too long.
Amanda, no, that's no problem. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So just one question. So you did mention that the gas tax was increased in the final version. So when will that become law? And do you have any idea, or are there any estimates of how much this will cost, like a regular person with a semi-new vehicle that's not
Sure.
electric?
Yeah. So it's set to go effect in July, and estimates are, say, for someone with a fairly, it's going to depend on how efficient your car is. And newer cars are more efficient than older cars. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $55, $60 for relatively efficient. But I also want to point out a couple things, is that low-income families tend to drive older and less reliable cars, so they're likely less fuel efficient. And then, of course, folks in rural areas have to drive a lot more. Urban areas, so you add in sort of high levels of poverty, likelihood that they have less efficient cars, but also that they're driving more, and the impact's going to be greater.
Absolutely. And then I know we talked about the EITC. Are there any other discussions about how to kind of mitigate that extra impact on our low-income families and low-income people, or any other ideas of kind of what the General Assembly could do to kind of fight that impact?
Sure. So one thing I didn't connect to is that not only is the earned income tax credit a way to ameliorate the burden, both the regressivity of the gas tax, but also, we've increasingly relied on sales taxes. But as far as transportation goes, public transit is the more affordable form of transportation. Because we've underinvested in it, in transit systems across the entire state, are they're just nowhere where they should be. But if we properly invested in it, got it to the point where it was convenient and reliable, we would be creating a system, an alternative option to driving. And that's not just for urban areas, it's rural areas too. We actually have 61 transit systems in Ohio, and more than half are in rural communities.
Mm-hmm. That's great. No, that's great to hear. So once again, thank you so much for everybody. We will stay on the line just for a few minutes in case there are any questions. Feel free to enter the attendee chat and send us some questions. But again, thank you for your time this morning. In 2 weeks, on the 19th, we will be discussing probably issues concerning TANF and programs that help needy families, specifically in our counties. And we will probably also be focusing on multi-system youth. So once we see that sub-bill that comes out of the major changes to the governor's version of the budget, we'll have a more extended version of what happened and what that means, the good and the bad, in the coming weeks. So once again, thank you so much for joining, everybody, and enjoy your Friday. Have a great weekend. Ooh, and we do have a question from the email. Thank you so much. This will be sent directly to people who registered for the webinar in just the next few minutes. The full recording will be available as well as the slides. We will again get that out by noon today. All right, everyone. AOF is signing off. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.